Hello, this is Mugwort and doing a very overdue recording of an old match played in November 2020 as part of the Crazyhouse World Championship for that year, the candidate stage. So this video was recorded live, Mugwort versus my old nemesis gsvc, who took me out 6-1 the previous 3+2 Crazyhouse World Championship in the year 2018. So we'll see what happens in 2020. So this is the first of 10 games of 3+2. And trying to remember some of my thoughts. I had a little bit of a look at the games, but the audio was recorded several months after the match was played. So already he surprised me in the first game with an early A6, and it's very similar to the match against Chicken Crossroad from an earlier round. So this is more of a bughouse opening, but you very rarely see the moves A6 and E6 together. So here E5 is fine, Bishop D3 is fine. White has control of the center, is under no pressure in the opening. gsvc, he actually prepared very well in 2018, but I think in 2020 he's throwing in some random openings just to try and surprise me. So seems like the E5 push is quite logical. I'm awfully slow watching the video back. But yeah, nothing wrong with E5. Trading is probably to White's advantage, because the knight will be rather unstable if it goes to G4. So here the main moves would be either Bishop G5 or Knight G5. Just opening up the Queen on D1. Often when I have a couple of options, I'll, instead of just making a move, I'll think for 30 seconds and run my time down. I don't know why I do this to myself. At Bishop G5, the main idea is to exchange on E7 and put the bishop back on H4, meaning that there's no good place to block with the black bishop, so he'll have to play F6. Queen D7 probably concedes too much control of the dark squares, and White will just continue H3. Taking on F6 is fine. Probably H3 is okay too. F2 is very well defended. The move Knight to E5 is interesting here. Again, opening up the queen, so if knight takes, pawn takes, d takes, I could probably sack a bishop on f6, follow up with knight e4, and then just keep putting pawns on f6 and g7 and so on. Aim is to overrun him with the pawns on the 7th rank. So White has so many tempi in that case that it justifies the piece sacrifice. But instead h3 I think is good too. Pawn at g5, he's going to take the bishop anyway, so I may as well throw it away. Bishop takes g5. If bishop g3, the knight does have room to back off to h6. So he has an option to desperado the knight on f2 if he likes. There we go. Rook takes f2, f takes g5. And I'm not sure if I did the most accurate move here. Perhaps I should be covering the bishop at e3 threat. I don't think knight takes g5 is the most accurate. It's a good response, bishop at e3. And here the move is king d7. It would have kept him in the game, king d7, because then he could have continued with bishop takes f2 check, king h1, queen takes g5. And with the king on d7, that makes a big difference. I'm not promoting on h8 with check. So that way he's threatening knight at g3 check and knight f1 mating. But of course now queen takes g5 doesn't work, which means he's pretty stuck on the back rank, what to do with the rook. He desperately needs a knight in hand or a rook to mate, but he's not going to get it with tempo. So I should win the first game with the white pieces. Yeah, he's having a long think, see if there's any way to survive, but it's a bit too far gone at this stage. And pawn at f6 I think is the cleanest way to win. Yep. Yeah, f takes e7 coming and put a rook somewhere on the back rank. I think rook at e8 was the fastest after that to block out the h8 rook. Okay, so with the black pieces, I'm going to play a rather unusual f6 on move 2. I've not particularly prepared against 2 bishop g5, so this will be a bit random. I often like to do the same thing, tucking the bishop back to d7 in case white plays f3 on bishop g4. So I know not to play bishop f5 too early, because then if you go e6 he'll play knight f3, knight h4. Tends to be good to hunt down that light squared bishop early. So I think e6 is the right move here, not bishop f5. I just said I know not to play bishop f5 for a different reason though. My main idea was to trade a pawn and stick it on c2. Probably e6 was a little bit more solid instead of bishop f5. But it's turning out okay. I have ideas to play bishop b4 and trade a knight on c3, put it back on c2. So I guess he's going to play rook c1 at some stage. There we go, bishop b4. And after black castles kingside, black should be very, very safe and not have to worry about any kingside attack. So the bishop is worth preserving. I think bishop g4 is good. And of course with the pawn on e6 there's no tricks with the queen sack and then a bishop at e6 check. So he'll just have to block with f3 or bishop e2. Yeah, with the knight sitting on h4, I've got to keep an eye on f5 and opening up the queen to take on h4. But may as well trade on c3 first. It does reduce the pressure on d5. And then have the idea to follow up with knight a5 if bishop takes. Yeah, as you can see, the mouse is over f6 and trying to push f5 if I can, but I'll change my mind. So yeah, that's what I mean, knight at f5. Can't play knight f5 in the position. So trading on c4 a couple of times. And then if he recaptures everything, I have bishop at d5 in the end. And it's looking pretty good for black at the moment. White is a little bit underdeveloped, Black has already castled, no particular weaknesses. I'm not quite sure what he was hoping for with knight h4, but he hasn't had a chance to trade for the bishop. Sometimes if you trade too many pieces, white can play things like pawn at g6, and then knight takes g6 only tends to be dangerous if there are a lot of pieces, or white already has a heavy piece in hand for h8. But otherwise, things are looking quite good at the moment. h3, unexpected move. May as well just grab the queen. There was an amazing shot here with knight takes d4, which did not come to my mind at all. Very surprising move. The main idea, if pawn takes, then stick the pawn back on g3. Trying to distract the f-pawn for queen at e3 check. And if bishop takes d4, then what was the crazy move? Something like c5. Alright, but nothing wrong with just saving the bishop. Bishop h5, perhaps a little bit more accurate. Just not allowing the knight to trade for the bishop. Yeah, and also keeping an eye on d1 in case I ever have a move like knight at c2 check. Yeah, bishop e4 is okay. I don't mind trades of pieces. Trades of pieces seem to favor black. Just a little bit worried about bishop e6 check, but probably nothing to worry about. Just stick the pawn back on f7. I can also take with the queen or the bishop. I think any capture is okay. I just should make a decision instead of running down below 30 seconds. f5 is good, opening up queen takes h4. And I don't mind if he goes towards c6, because that's towards my queen side. And I really should take the opportunity to attack with a move like f4. So main idea, e takes f4, queen takes g3, followed by queen at e3 check. This move, not so incisive, it's okay. Intending taking on f2 as well as possibly g3. Yeah, so trying to bust open the f-file with moves like knight takes f2 followed by f4. So if he takes on b7, I think I can just ignore that and go for the attack. Of course I can just play rook a e8 if I want to. So bishop e5 covers the knight. It's not really threatening the king. At some stage in this game, I'm a bit worried about the bishop pointing towards my king, but there's no need to worry at the moment. If king takes f2, just keep pushing f4. May as well take the knight, queen at f2 check. And as Jasugi pointed out in the game chat, simple move, knight takes g3, white has no threat, and black should easily go on to win on material with big threats of pawn at e2 and queen takes f1 check. Yeah, just desperately short on time, not finding the right moves. My pieces are not combining. I'm losing material, and he has mate threats of rook at h8 check, all of which I missed. Yeah, so I'm just throwing in useless checks. And the main point is, I just didn't realize in a few seconds that the bishop on e5 doesn't pose a threat if he doesn't have the amount of heavy pieces that he does right now. So now, of course, he can play rook at h8, bishop takes g7, queen at e7, and unfortunately he's mating in a couple of moves, so I really threw away that game trying to attack with checks when I could have just taken free pieces. I'm sure I would have been more sensible if I had more time, but I do this to myself. So this is game 3, score is 1-all. Same opening again. Well, actually slightly different because he didn't play d5 before e6. So this is more of a chicken crossroad opening. And I have been playing an early bishop g5. Not the sort of thing I'd do in Bughouse, because bishop b4 and then yeah, pawn at a3 is coming. But in Crazyhouse, white does have enough to deal with the pawn at a3 threat in the line that we're about to see with knight f3 and bishop d3. It seems very illogical if you haven't seen it before, because it's even inviting a pawn at e4 winning a piece, and white just ignores that castle's kingside and takes back the pawn because it's going to be put on e5 eventually with the aim to win back the piece. Yeah, so just like this. And the other option was pawn at a3, as chicken crossroad did a couple of times. Yeah, so e takes f3, queen takes f3, I have pressure on f6, pawn at e5 coming, and it's completely fine. It's more than fine. It's actually good for white. Now, there's nothing wrong with bishop takes f6, which is, I think, the most obvious move. If queen takes, you just hit the queen with bishop at e5 and queen g6, knight at h4. If g takes f6, then perhaps a slower build-up, maybe pawn at e5. Again, if there's no good way to save the piece, I can not bother and just continue by other means. Bishop at h4 is, as played in the game, is decent. Maybe not the most critical move. So it's interesting that he's refusing to take either of the pieces and just leave the fork there on e4. So here knight at h5 is an important move, just to slow him down with the rook g8. So make him defend first on f6. Yeah, knight at h5, looking back, is very obvious to me. I have no idea why I didn't just play it straight away. Yeah, rook e1 is often what I would do. It's just not so good with the knight already on e6. So with two pieces plugging up the e-file. I think rook g8 is a very good response, as he played in the game. And now I have problems, because I think knight at h5 doesn't work due to e takes f3, knight takes f6, queen f6, bishop f6, and knight at h3 check. You'll even notice that with the knight on c6 covering the queen drops, I don't even have any direct mate after he sacks his queen on f6. And I'm probably getting mated after king f1 in that other line. So, knight at h5, I just said I can't do that. And I'm about to find out why. I mean, of course, I don't have to continue. Knight takes f6 check. There are other options like queen takes f3. So, yeah, perhaps after all it was more accurate not to take on f3 just yet. Leave the fork. Quite amazing how long this fork on e4 has lasted. But he will be taking my pieces, I assure you. Yeah, so bishop e7, very good defensive move. The rook is really well placed on g8. The knight is well placed on e6. Black's pieces are combining very well in defense. There's not really a lot going on for white at the moment. So taking the bishop, putting it back on g4. And yeah, there's no use going forwards to sack the knight because I'm just running out of pieces. I think I need to bring the knight back to g3. The two pawns may be enough compensation for the piece. I mean, it's only one pawn, but two in hand. Because there are quite a few black pieces not doing a great job at the moment in attack. So perhaps the weakness on the dark squares is enough, but I really need a knight in hand to justify giving up another piece with f18, f4. Yeah, so GSVC I think is doing exactly the right thing here, just leaving the queen. There's nothing without a knight for f6. Yeah, and the queen's coming out to h6, just leaving the pawn on e7. I don't have enough pieces to continue any sort of attack. And he's also threatening on e3 with check. Whoops. Yeah, and after king h1, pawn at h3 should finish me off. So well done. First win with black. Yeah, that should be it. If I have to defend with queen f1, you can just trade and replace, and that should be it. So 2-1 GSVC. See if I can possibly strike back with the black pieces, but I am assuming after the first game that he's going to go d4 with the white pieces every game. Learned from Chicken and Jisugi. What did I do last time? He played bishop g5, so he's varying the move order with both colors in every game. Seems like a good match strategy if you're expecting your opponent to prepare specific variations. It's not so easy to do with d4, the openings though. So coming back, I'm wondering if he'll continue g4, but no, g3. Alright. So playing the clear cast and blitz bullet system. Yeah, I don't know what I'm thinking about. If there's any other move apart from e6. I'm not sure about an early bishop b4. I think I changed my mind. I was thinking about bishop b4 and trading and replacing a knight on e4. And this move may be a waste of time, a6. I probably should just play knight f6 to avoid the move that we just see on the screen. Yeah, there's just no use trying to be fancy when you have natural developing moves. Knight f6, if knight b5, just ignore it and go knight e4. He can trade on d6, c supports the center, and black is fine out of the opening. There's no need to be too creative in the first 8 moves. And probably white is already a little bit better now. I'm choosing to withdraw the bishop and still haven't developed the knight on g8. So he'll defend d4. I think from memory he played c3. So kicking away the knight before knight f6. That just avoids trades for white with tempo. Perhaps he had a more aggressive move, the knight back to d2. I wonder if I can ignore this threat and just castle. Queen takes b7, knight a5. Queen does appear to be trapped, but I think nothing wrong with rook b8. Well, it's a fairly balanced position. I wouldn't say either side can really claim an edge here. If I want to stop pawn at h6, I can always go pawn to h6. Might have been a good time to go on the attack with bishop takes f3, knight takes d4, followed by pawn at g4. I had the idea to sack a knight eventually on f2. I don't think I quite have enough trades at the moment. Could just ignore it and go pawn at g4. I think pawn at g4 was good. You always got to be a little bit careful. You can't play pawn at g7 and then somehow grab a heavy and mate you on h8. I don't know why I didn't take that. I could have just gone f takes g4. Was I worrying too much about rook takes e4? I mean, but he doesn't have a knight drop anyway. With check. So king h8 is safe, but I think I had better than this. Anyway, I don't really think I'm any worse at the moment. Perhaps had a couple of chances to push for an initiative on the king side. But my next move is terrible. After bishop at f4, I should not play bishop at g7 because it's just inviting a pawn trade and then pawn at h6. I mean, if I'm going to put anything, I should place a pawn on g7 and not the bishop, because I'm giving up a bit of material here. Could sack on f2 and then g takes f4. So now I do have to be careful when he picks up that knight on f2. There's also queen takes e6 coming and pawn at h6 to watch for. So threats from all angles, but it's mainly the knight at g6 move that I was worried about during the game. So this is why I'm looking to withdraw the knight from f2 and go knight to d3. But perhaps I could have blocked out the pawn at h6 attack, or played something like bishop e to f6, or bishop at h6, pawn at h6 even. Yeah, I'm really overestimating my chances with taking on e1 because I have to defend first. And you can see he already has 3 pawns in hand, and I have to give away bishops if I'm playing a move like bishop e to f6. It's bishops for pawns, and this often happens in Bughouse where your opponent just keeps dumping pawns on you. So yeah, looks like I missed my chances earlier. Just gave up way too many pawns, and now he can sack and just keep dropping pawns on the board. Also, just bishop takes d3 first to pick up a knight if he wants. And is this the moment where he sacked the bishop on g6? Does look mating. So yeah, I can't take it because of queen g4 or queen at f5 or something, anything. Probably anything is mating for white. There's just too many diagonals. Yeah, he can just calmly take back on e1 and black has nothing. And now there's too many pawns. So I'm going down here, 3-1 to GSVC. And I'll try and find an improvement on the white game. What was my mistake in game number 3? Oh, we're going to find out because we see the same line here, I believe. And of course e5 is another system where black will leave the piece there and go d5. Where the move a6 does come in handy because then you can play knight c6 and not have to worry about bishop b5. So same again. Pawn at e4 castles. Take, take, knight at e6, bishop at h4. And we'll see who's the first player to deviate from game 3. Obviously I have to deviate somewhere if there's a repetition because I really didn't get any opening advantage after about 12-13 moves. So yeah, I think rook e1 was my first mistake, which was played on what about move 12 or so in the previous game. I'm just having a look at my options here to see if there's anything better than bishop at h4. And as mentioned earlier in the video, bishop takes f6 is the most natural move. And if g takes, then I have to decide how to follow up. Perhaps a move like bishop at g4 after that, trying to trade a knight for g7. And if he goes rook g8, then not exactly sure. Maybe even something like moving the knight from f3 to h4 and f5, opening the queen to defend g4. Or just directly with pawn at e5 instead of bishop at g4. So, did I do knight e5 last time? I think I did rook e1, didn't I? So this is already new. Or maybe I took on f6 first. So this is looking much better already than game number 3, because if I really want to save the piece, I can just play bishop e2 anytime. I'd rather take first and go knight at e5. So because Chicken Crossroad was playing pawn at a3 instead of pawn at e4, I don't think I've actually had the position before this match, which was played in November 2020. I don't think I've actually faced pawn at e4 in a game. I looked at it a little bit in analysis, because it's very bold to invite pawn at e4 without at least knowing what the heck you're doing and why you're giving up a piece for nothing. So here the main idea is to distract the bishop away from f5. And of course the target on g7. Displacing the king. So the question is now, do I take the queen, or is there a better move? I'm not compelled to take the queen. Maybe this is nothing really special for white. Pawn is very useful though for h6 if he goes d takes. If knight takes, no, I'm happy just to go for the bishop on e7. And white's attack is very quick on the dark squares, so he'll really need to do something to bolster the squares like h6 and f6 after knight takes e4 and bishop takes e7, as is happening right now. Okay, this came as a surprise. Queen takes e2. What's wrong with this? What's the big idea? As I always say, if the queen can land on g4, then it's pretty much always safe. Or I should say, more to the point, it's pretty much well placed on g4, attacking and defending. There's no knight forks with the queen on g4. You're always threatening smothered mates potentially with knight at h6. But here, it looks like I just removed the defender on g7, sack the queen, and keep dropping the pawns. Should be mate in about 6 or 7 from here. Yeah, so the idea is already in my head. It's just a matter of counting the pawns and making sure I'm not missing something obvious. So there's a possible getaway with bishop at h4 and the end king f5, but then I have queen at g5, king e6, and queen takes f6, checkmate. So you notice the knight on e5 covering the escape on d7 in that line. So that's why I'm eventually going to play bishop at h4 when the king is on g5. And as happens in the game, if king takes h4, then I'm going to cut off the retreat with queen at h6 and mate next move. So yeah, this is the moment I was talking about before. So bishop at h4 is a little bit more accurate than pawn at h4 or pawn to h4. Okay, 2 games to 3. I still haven't won a game with the black pieces yet. I've had some chances in every game. And we have a slightly different variation again with knight f3. And no knight c3 this time. So, also slightly different placing of the bishop on f5, not on g4, where it gets hit with h3. I think it's a little bit more accurate in this line to go bishop f5. And you'll see, of course, here that I'm not wasting any time with knight f6, not mucking around, leaving the knight undeveloped and allowing white to play a quick e4. So now just deciding between bishop e7 and bishop d6. And again, I think bishop d6 probably a little bit more accurate, because it does stop bishop f4, even though sometimes there might be a knight h5 in follow-up. But when the bishop comes to g5 or e3, then what's the knight doing on h5? Yeah, bishop f4, not really threatening knight b5. There's always rook c8, but it does help with control of the e5 square. So perhaps in a faster time control, or another day I would play h5 instead of castles and just wait for a pawn to appear in my hand and go pawn at g4. Could even sack the bishop on h3 and follow up pawn at g4. I mean, white does have defensive resources in that case, putting a new bishop back on g2, for instance. Just playing it safe for the moment with h6. Intending knight e4. There's no reason for black to fear anything. I should just play knight e4. And black is completely fine. So bishop takes g3 is on the cards. There's no reason why not to play bishop takes g3 here. F takes, knight takes. 2 pawns in hand. Perhaps I'm overly worried about a sack on h6. But it's not really much of a threat. King h7, of course, is another choice. But then knight takes e4, and there's a possible knight at g5 check coming. Not even sure how dangerous that is. But at least he's making me think. Maybe that was the whole purpose, rather than to play a move that's objectively very powerful. Even if he sacks on h6, don't know, can't I just put a bishop on g7 and say that you don't have enough attacking forces? Yeah, queen f6, I mean, it's okay, but unnecessary. So what's the next move going to be? Yeah, a little bit of a surprise. I wasn't sure what he wanted to do with the pawn. Pawn to e5. Just move the queen to e6 and threaten bishop takes h3. So we're going to see an interesting position where both the queen and bishops are staring at the h-pawn. After e takes d6, he's actually giving me a chance to take on h3. I probably should do it. And then take bishop at g2. I would decide whether to sack the queen or perhaps just bring the queen back to h5. It looks fairly secure on h5. But c takes d6 I think is also completely fine. A bit surprised with the move g4. I thought, yeah, backing off the bishop was okay. Better than sacking and then allowing bishop at h3. Alright, also a bit of a surprise. I'm not used to gsvc sacking on me like this. He's normally very conservative with the material. So I should be looking at moves like pawn at g3 next. Even knight takes f2 followed by bishop at e3 or pawn at g3. Yeah, knight takes f2 is good. Knight at g3 is also very powerful, threatening knight takes e2 check. This move, again, I'm just not choosing the best moves. I'm not finding the best moves. I'm more like finding the third or fourth best move in going for the initiative. It's a good idea to undermine all the dark squares and then go for dark square control with bishop at e3. Don't quite have enough pieces. I mean, he can afford to sack the queen and defend. So, a very impressive move is knight at h5, which he does in the game. I think after queen takes e3. Or maybe I'm missing something. Because it's a very good square for the knight on h5 to both attack and defend. I always have to watch out if he gets another knight in hand for f6. And it defends key squares like g3 and f4. So he probably has the idea to sack the queen. It's just a matter of when and how. Or does he let me take on c1? I would probably rather take on f2 rather than c1. So no queen sack. Not yet anyway. Pawn at g3 check looks obvious. And what was better than knight takes d4? f5 I think was very dangerous for white. Just opening the f file, threatening the f4 push. Even to take on g4 and follow up with bishop f4 looks almost fatal. White would have to be very careful in defense. Yeah, maybe this is the moment I'm thinking where he sacks his queen on e3. No, I can't allow knight takes d4. I think it's all over because if I take the queen on f2, I don't have enough defense on f6 and g7, so yeah, it's already lost. I had to defend, but then he's just picking up too much material and defending and keeping the queen on f2. So I missed a lot of chances in that game. Starting with probably the most accurate move, knight at g3 instead of pawn at h2. And yeah, I know it. I certainly know I missed a lot of chances. It's just when you have a good feeling about a position, that's not enough to win the game. You actually need to find some good moves on top of that. But even after pawn at h2, what did I say? f5 or... I think bishop takes d3 was even another way to pick up a pawn. Another pawn for f4 and g3. But yeah, f5. Sometimes making space around the king is not a bad thing, because then the rook on f8 comes into play. The queen is more useful in defense along the 7th rank. Alright, we see a new move, pawn at h3 in game number 7. So my first thought is queen e2 check. He probably has to block with the queen. And then I decide, do I take the queen straight away, or do I go bishop takes f6? Probably bishop takes f6 a little more accurate, but still nothing wrong with queen takes e7 check. It means I don't have to worry about moves like h takes g2 followed by pawn at a3. If the bishop is back on e7 defending, I always have the option to take on f6 and then knight takes d5, which is my main idea. He could do an in-between move h takes g2, but it's not much of a worry after rook g1. He's just waiting for me to take on h3, and then he can play queen or bishop at g2, but I'm not going to bother with that. Just, yeah, queen knight takes d5. Queen at a5 check, put a new knight on c3, maintaining the threat to go invading on g7 with knight takes f6 check. So I'm expecting knight at c3 and then bishop at d8. So that's a new bishop on d8 for extra coverage. If he brings the bishop back to d8, then not quite sure. Probably pawn at h6. Queen at e5 check is also an option after bishop back to d8. So here my only decision is whether to take on f6 immediately or just play rook g1 first. But I didn't feel any oncoming danger after rook g1. So then he still has to decide how to cover the dark squares, because of course the main point of attack is on g7. So if the new bishop goes on d8, then probably pawn at e5 to dislodge the bishop on f6. I think the most accurate way to attack is knight takes f6 and pawn at g7, queen at h8. Probably nothing wrong with pawn at e5. Did I do pawn at e5 in the game? From memory I did, but it was played 3 months ago. So out of nothing but sheer laziness, I've not done a commentary on this match after it was played. Pawn at h6, very obvious move, just to bust a hole on g7. And black is really struggling to make counterplay here. He's got to stop pawn at pawn takes g7 and queen at h8. So I think this might be the moment where he tries for some sort of counterplay with pawn at d2 check. Or was it bishop g4 first? So knight takes d4, deflecting the knight away from d2, so he has a check. It is only a check. King d1, I think most accurate, just to preserve the pawn on h6 so that there's no bishop at g5 check. And I was just calculating what happens on bishop g4. I'm prepared to play bishop back to e2. And even let him capture on e2 a couple of times, because one knight is certainly not enough to checkmate me. and even multiple knights, depending on whether I'm covering squares like e3 and f2. So I can go ahead and take on g7. Yeah, I think he might resign here because there's no good way to stop knight at f6 check or take the rook. Okay, pretty convincing with the white pieces. Seem to get more and more chances with black every single game, but find a new way to botch it every time. Alright, so we're just going to see a direct repetition here in game number 8. So bishop d6 does come in handy if he plays the move h3. So you see this time he's avoiding the move h3. And I'm not sure where the bishop belongs. Perhaps bishop g4 is most accurate. Although it looks like it wastes time after h3, bishop h5. If he wants to push ahead with g4, then there's a very interesting sacrifice. Castles, g takes, knight takes. Threatening queen takes h4, and I have a pawn in hand. His kingside is a bit busted. So, not that I saw that during the game, but it's quite an interesting sideline. So he's traded a knight on e4, gone bishop at g5. And threatening to pick up a pawn on e4, so I should do something about this. So if he captures on f6, there are targets on h4 and d4. So it's not just a free pawn on e4 that he's picking up. And knight c6 seems quite decent here. Trying to provoke c3. And then I think in the game that I played h6, but probably just castles was okay. I'm always scared to castle with bishops facing the square h6. That was probably okay. I'm not so worried here. I have very good control over the square h7. Can drop a bishop there if necessary, but I think knight g4 is a better move. Knight at g4 rather. Just immediately trying to kick the bishop out of the way. So queen d2 now. Now what? I would like, with only one white pawn in hand, I'd like to castle queenside, so this explains the next move, queen d5. Also have some ideas to swing the queen over to h5 and threaten the bishop on h6. If pawn at e5, the knight can just drop back to h7. And there seems to be no danger. Also possibly I can just sack the knight on c6. Okay, so ignoring the threat on the knight, castle queenside, because then, yeah, knight takes, there's not that much a white knight can do to hurt me at the moment. And it opens up the threat, bishop takes h4, followed by pawn at f3. So he really doesn't want to take the knight on g4. I was more expecting f takes e4, pawn at f3. So here's a critical moment, and it was perfectly fine to just bring the queen back to h7. Queen sack is not necessary. It's interesting, especially if I follow up with, after knight at h3, check king d2. Just a prophylactic move with king b8 to avoid any queen check. And the idea is if king takes h3, knight takes h6, queen takes h6, just drop the bishop back to e7 and say, okay, I've got lots of bishops in hand. My king is very safe on b8. I've got moves like bishop at g5 coming, trying to pick up the pawn on g7. Perhaps find a way to swing the other rook over to h8. And that's a big mess. Hard to say who's winning. But very comfortable for black. But yeah, this knight h takes f2 looks more threatening than it is, because actually the king is very safe on g1, the white king. And he's got moves like knight at c5 coming, so it doesn't matter which way I block. Knight at c5 is going to be extremely dangerous. Of course, I can cover for the moment with bishop at c6, but as we'll see a bit later, there is more attacking potential than just knight at c5. So white to play. Notice the knight on e7 is covered with the bishop on h4, so he's looking to remove the bishop, pick up a knight, and do a smothered mate with knight at e7. Again, this move is more threatening than it looks, because even if I go knight takes f2, there's no direct threat. So he can continue just picking up the bishop, threatening the smothered mate, as mentioned before. And I think the last chance he was bishop at d6, covering the mate and also threatening bishop takes c5. Or maybe I'm even talking before knight takes f2. Because after I drop the rook, yeah, no, it was before he picked up the bishop, it was before knight takes f2. Because now this move is deadly. I can't take it due to bishop at b7. So if I did bishop at d6 before he picked up a bishop on h4, of course it's hard to see all this with under 20 seconds on the clock. But yeah, lots of critical moments there where I had some improvements. But the most exciting variation was actually an extremely sober move, king b8, instead of going for the attack with knight h takes f2. Alright, we see a line which was played previously versus Penguin, GIM, which that match was tied, 5 games all, Mugwort versus Penguin in an earlier round. But this exact line happened with the pawn sack. I think the Lone Wolf was the first to play it against Penguin. So he got a massive opening advantage, but somehow went on to lose. And I'm hoping not to do the same. I did win this particular game against Penguin. Now the idea of this move is to deflect the bishop so that queen at e7 comes with a fork. And Penguin found the defense queen at d6. And then I went queen takes f6. Pawn at e7, and then I missed a brilliant move. Queen takes e5, followed by knight takes f7. But somehow went on to win, and it wasn't so convincing. But in this game, GSVC finds a better defense with... Oh, actually, no, I can't say a better defense, but a different defense at least. With... what did he do? Rook e8, I think it was. Or maybe he let me take the rook. No, I can't remember. Bishop takes g5, was it? Maybe it was bishop takes g5 here. Anyway, the plan is very simple. I'm going to take something on the next turn. So on the next move, I don't have to think, no matter what happens. Alright, have a check. Pat's a c check. Queen takes d8 check. Knight at e8, I'm assuming. Oh no, queen at e8. Well, this way I can trade queens and pick up the bishop. I do have to look at all the knight checks after that. Knight at h3 and knight at f3. Now, one key point is if he goes knight at h3 after the queen trade, I can take it because knight f3, king h1, pawn at g2, king takes g2. Then the pawn is covering the queen at g4 check. The pawn on h3, I mean. But if he goes knight at f3 check, I don't take it with g takes f3 because then queen at g4 in the same sequence. Missing the pawn on h3 is mating with all the pawns coming on h3, g2. So if you can't quite see what I'm talking about, then it will become clear in a couple of moves. I'm just looking for something better than queen trade and bishop takes g5, but there is nothing better. It's good enough. But yeah, I have to see the line knight at h3. I can take it, and there is no mate for black. After knight f3, king h1, pawn at g2, king takes g2. Even knight h4 doesn't work. Bishop takes, pawn at f3. I can just keep taking and eventually getting away. So, of course, GSVC is looking at the obvious moves, the knight checks. And another key point is that white does have a threat with rook at f8 check. King takes, bishop at e7, and queen at f8 mate. So he has to cover that by taking the bishop on g5 or defending one of the squares like e7 or f8. So here I worked out that I cannot take because there is an eventual queen at g4 leading to mate. But it's perfectly fine to sidestep with king h1. Knight takes g5, and then I have a move. I don't have to do a check because black has no threat. So I can put the queen on d8 and make a fork on the knights, for example. So expecting something like queen at f8 defending. Whereas then I have a choice to pick up the knight on g5 or bishop at e7 is a little bit too slow because it doesn't come with a check threat. So he can play pawn at h3 and counterattack, so I should just pick up the knight in that case with queen takes g5. Other options for black? Well, he can try to attack here with pawn at h3, but it's not going to end well for him, as we're about to find out. Okay, so the main idea is pawn at h3, queen takes e8, something blocks, and then rook at h8 should finish very quickly. Yeah, resigns. There's no way he's going to survive coming out to f5 because I have a knight at e3 and bishop at g3 to finish. Okay, so 4 games to 5. This game to tie the match. And again, I am having chances in every game. In game number 8, where I'm trying to think which game it was now. And that was the game where, oh yeah, so I castled queenside and didn't have to sack the queen. Could have gone queen back to h7, and it was totally fine. But even after the queen sack, there was a prophylaxis with king b8. Yeah, so this game I'm trying bishop g6 instead of bishop e4. And again, bishop g4 there is okay. Nothing wrong with bishop g4. Again, dropping the bishop back just for extra protection, because I think it's useful to have the bishop pointing against the knight on h4. Perhaps not completely necessary to play bishop e7. And a better move may have been bishop h5. just to avoid any knight trade from h4. And it also means that I can play h6 without allowing knight takes g6. Okay, find a useful move for black. Knight e4 is about all that I could see. Giving me some options. Was it so bad to take on d2? I'm not sure it was so bad to take on d2. But anyway, I chose the safer option. And maybe bishop takes c7 in that case. Alright, so pawn takes does invite, if he wants to go grab a pawn with knight takes g6, but it does of course open the h file now that I have not castled. So of course bishop takes e4, the other option. I'm not really sure why I didn't take with the d pawn. I think it was okay. Now here there's an interesting option to ignore the threat on g7 and castle queenside. It'll be the first move in my head if I didn't have a rook in hand, of course, in Bughouse, and there was no rook coming for g1. Because of course there is a smothered mate with knight at h3. And that point is actually very important because, as we're going to see in a moment, there is a very sharp option, and probably here queen takes f6 was a little bit more accurate, because bishop at g5, knight at c4, then if the queen trade, then I'm threatening knight at h3, so that's how the smothered mate comes in. But I didn't see the response knight at c4 on queen takes f6 and bishop at g5, which I really did have to see, otherwise I'm just throwing my queen away for one minor piece. So what's happening here? White is very safe after this trade, and bishop at g2. I'm really struggling for a good idea. Perhaps after bishop at g5, bishop at e3. Interesting move is knight takes f2 check, with the idea rook takes bishop e3, queen e3, knight at g4. Then I'm picking back something. But this move order is not so good because he's sacking the queen for two knights. And look at all the squares he's covering, g2, f2, f3. It's very hard to find a way in. Perhaps I should just not try to attack and go for castle's queenside or bishop at a6 or something safe. Even then, bishop at a6, he's got knight at c5 coming. So this is an attempt to win back some material. But here he's going to play an interesting move and just ignore the threat on e2 and go for a counter-attack with knight takes f6 check. Another option for him was bishop at g7. But yeah, just ignoring the threats seems like a good idea. Because I don't have enough attack on the square g2, I'm trying to remove one of the defenders on g2 and also defend f6 at the same time. So it seems like he's going to overrun me with the minor pieces, so I have to do something to counterattack or sack the queen just to avoid losing too many tempi with the minor pieces. Queen takes e2, I think was what happened in the game. So there is a moment in the game where I have a chance, but actually GSVC has the first chance to put me away. And it's coming right here. I had to defend somehow, maybe king takes e7. But knight takes f6 check is the most obvious move. It is mating. Maybe he thought I was getting away after king takes e7, queen at d7, king takes f6. But there was a mate somewhere there. Bishop at g5, king g7. Bishop at h6 followed by knight at f4, I think was it. Oh, there are different paths for the king, but there were certainly enough minor pieces to mate, even if the queen wasn't directly involved on d7. So knight takes f6 is something like mate in 6 for white, but after a long think, gsvc, what does he do? He plays a more positional move here. I'm not sure, I don't remember what he did. He's giving me one last chance to equalize the match. Now obviously I want a pawn for g2. If I can get a pawn for g2, then I'm close to winning. It's a very strange move, bishop at g5, I don't understand. So running away via d7, maybe he calculated something. But I think he's just a pawn short, because now he has to drop a bishop on d7. And perhaps he thought he was mating with knight takes c6 check in the end, but you notice the queen on e2 is covering the square a6, so when the king is on b8, there's no knight at a6 check. So I'm not trading the knight for obvious reasons. No need to give him more pieces in hand to attack me with. So bishop at d7, king b8, and now he's got to defend with the rook f2. Pawn at g2 is good, but then I should just simply take the bishop with check, and then there's knight takes e5, and no threats against my king. Black is winning. Unfortunately, I missed that the queen momentarily was drawn away from a6, although I saw that before, I just forgot in the time scramble, and that is it. Final score 6-4. Had a chance to equalize the match, but well done GSVC, he's got me again, but much closer match this time. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you in the next one.